thank you very much to the Adam Smith Institute and to the University of London and to the University of Bahrain and to Professor Khalid Al-Khalifa for sponsoring our event and to all of you for coming. Nice to see the students here, particularly nice to see one or two people here who are in the private sector. I always think that we politicians should say this more. We're very good, we politicians, at saying thank you to doctors and nurses and teachers and soldiers. Quite right, so we should be. But I wish we would sometimes find occasion to say thank you to the private sector workers who generate the surplus that pays for the doctors and the teachers and the soldiers and us. So anyone in that category, if only on this one occasion you're going to get it from a politician, thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to take you back to the period of the Prophet's exile in Medina. There was a food shortage. It was a common enough occurrence in 7th century Arabia. And exactly as would happen now, people responded by demanding price controls. And we read in the hadiths that a delegation of citizens of Medina came to the Prophet and said, you have to tell them to cut their prices in the marketplace because people can't afford food. And how did the Prophet respond? This is an extraordinary thing, 1,000 years before the Adam Smith who is commemorated in this institute. He sends the delegation away and he tells them, prices are in the hands of God, or provision is in the hands of God. Right? Now just stop and think for a second about how in advance of its time that idea was. How difficult it is even now. Cast your minds back actually only as far as the lockdowns and the associated panic during the pandemic. How many people did you hear who had real conceptual difficulty with the price mechanism? How many times did you hear the sentiment expressed, why are we allowing this profiteering on hand sanitizer or PPE, or why can't they give the vaccines away for nothing, right? Now, all of you, I hope, being devotees of Adam Smith, will understand what would happen if we did that. The price mechanism is a very good way of telling the producer to make more of something, right? If you forced the pharma companies to give away the vaccine, or if you forced the companies that make gloves or PPE or whatever to give it away, you'd get less of it, right? Well, the Prophet was a businessman. He'd spent his life until then as a trader. So he understood exactly what would happen if you set an artificially low price by government diktat. You get an initial rush, an initial glut, and then it doesn't pay anyone to bring things to market anymore, and so you end up with a worse shortage than before. A lot of free market ideas are counterintuitive in the exact sense of that word. They run up against instincts and intuitions that are buried deep in our genome. We're not designed for this world of skyscrapers and superabundance. We evolved on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa. And we work on the basis of a number of rules of thumb, of heuristics, right? And I think intuitively, we think that just as an object has an intrinsic volume and an intrinsic weight, so it has an intrinsic value. And when we see that value being altered by market forces that we haven't bothered to get our heads around, we call it profiteering. And this, down the centuries, has been the cause of not only a lot of very bad economic policy, but the cause of pogroms and riots and all sorts of misery. Islam never had that issue. Right from the beginning, it was comfortable with the idea of money honestly earned and being put to good use being a blessing. The Prophet used his very last sermon on earth to say, people, your lives and your property are sacred. Now, I don't think Christianity reached that moment until at least the 16th century. In the early church, there was a real problem with the idea of wealth and profit. The one time that Jesus is directly asked about this, he says something pretty hard to live up to. He's asked by a chap who's kept the law all his life. He says, I've done everything I'm supposed to do, I've done everything that, what else do I need to do? And he gets the chilling answer, if thou wilt be perfect, sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and follow me. Right now, the point of the story is that the poor chap can't do it, and neither can almost anybody else. But that was the ideal, until Christianity moved after the Reformation from what the great historian R.H. Tawney called a distributive to an acquisitive ethic. It took a long time to get comfortable with the idea that if you were doing good things with it, wealth was a blessing. And that was, as I say, that was never an issue. I've never been able to find any serious school of Islamic jurisprudence that argues that there is a problem. There's a problem with being selfish, greedy, not using your talents wisely, but there is no intrinsic problem with wealth. I say all this by way of introducing what I've always thought is one of the more bizarre things that we take for granted in this country, which is, and indeed throughout the West, which is, why is it that most British Muslims vote for parties that are on the left and are completely dismissive of everything that I've just said? And it seems to me an underexplored topic, and a significant one. So in the 2019 election, according to the British Election Survey, 80% of British Muslims voted Labour. In fact, it's 2019 for Corbyn. Yeah? An election where Labour got the worst vote overall since 1935. 80%. Now, that fell very slightly in the last election, but only because there was a big move to some of the kind of Gaza independence, right? So it was not a move in a free market direction. And I think this is a much more surprising factor than we realise. It doesn't happen in most Muslim majority democracies. If we think about, if we just think about the countries of origin of the majority of British Muslims, Bangladesh, Pakistan, there, generally the parties of the left are the more aggressively secular or anti-clerical ones. The religious parties, if you like, tend to be the ones that privatise and cut taxes and open markets, which of course is exactly in line with what you would expect given the tenets of the religion. And yet it doesn't happen here. By the way, I'm not arguing, just to be clear about this, I'm not arguing that any of the great religions is political, right? I'm not going to try and argue that Muhammad was a capitalist any more than that Jesus was a socialist. These are, it's absurd to try and press them into contemporary arguments. Okay? They were, all prophets of revealed religions are dealing in metaphysical truths. All of them are fundamentally interested in another world than this one, and so it's a mistake to read too much into it. And yet, we also acquire ethics and a way of looking at the world from the culture in which we're raised, whether or not we're personally devout. And so it's unsurprising to me that you have this left-right axis in Muslim majority countries. It's very striking when you talk to the real lefties in the Arab world or in South Asia, that their favourite conspiracy theory is that these Islamist parties are all CIA fronts and are all run by the Americans. Not the way it's generally seen in the US. Why does that happen? Well, I think the answer is that in this country and in most of the West, philosophical, ethical and religious questions have been subordinated to the ruling ideology of woke, of DEI. The world is seen as a pyramid of oppression and servitude. And where you slot into that pyramid defines everything else. Or to put it another way, the majority of Muslims in this country were initially seen when they arrived not as Muslims, but as people who were not white, and therefore in a victim category, and everything else was built around that. And hence we got the idea that somehow free markets were a colonial imposition, and that to resist it was a legitimate voice of resistance against a patriarchal and oppressive state. But I have to say, historically, that puts everything exactly back to front. The Islamic civilization was mercantile and property-based centuries before Europe was. In the Prophet's time, we had camel trains and trading missions traveling from Europe to China on the basis of what we would now more or less call a joint stock venture with limited liability. It took Europe a long time to get to that. What's the imposition, if we must talk in these terms, what's the colonial imposition on the Arab world, or more widely, on the Islamic world? What's the Western imposition? It's not capitalism, it's precisely the opposite. The real imposition from this part of the world in the Arab world is Nasserism, it's Baathism, it's Arab socialism, it's every other half-baked rotten idea to have come out of a bad Western university. And so, returning to a culture of property and contract. You know that the longest verse in the Quran is about the correct way to write a contract, right? Returning to that which is the genuinely indigenous culture, it seems to me, would be a far better way of honouring the patrimony of that region. Am I overdoing this? Am I overstating? Because of course, there's left and right in every culture, in every civilization. I want to talk just very quickly about some of the people, some of the institutions that I think have shaped Islamic civilization. I'm going to take one of each, just illustratively. The person I'm going to take is the great 14th century Tunisian sage Ibn Khaldun, who I think can fairly be described as the inventor of Austrian economics, or something very close to what we now understand by Austrian economics. There was a wonderful moment in the run-up to that 2019 election when Boris Johnson was asked by Sophie Ridge. It's a great interview. She said, so you're going to increase spending on the NHS, you're going to increase spending on defence, you're going to increase spending on the police, and you're going to cut taxes. How are you going to do that? And Boris said, well, of course, it was the great Tunisian sage Ibn Khaldun who showed that you can cut tax rates while getting more revenue. And I love the of course there. I thought it was a great Boris touch. Of course, everyone's going to know about Ibn Khaldun. It's true. I mean, this is the insight that is usually attributed to the great American economist Art Laffer. That there is an optimum point where you get the maximum amount of revenue for the tax rate you've got, and if tax rates go above that, then the revenue begins to fall because you disincentivize work. But Art Laffer himself never claimed to have invented it. He always attributed it to Khaldun, who was also, by the way, a great privatizer. And he had this whole chapter about why privately owned enterprises will always, over time, outperform enterprises, as he puts it, owned by princes. Right? Now, of course, like I say, Khaldun's not the only writer of that time. You could argue that Khaldun was actually the very end of the real golden age of free inquiry and free thought in the Muslim world, and that after that, things became more statist and more introverted. But still, how extraordinary to have those sentiments in the 14th century. How many centuries before the European Enlightenment caught up with them? And when I say caught up with them, I kind of mean that. I was just very recently reviewing a book about the influence of Islam on John Locke, who has, I think, as good a claim as anyone to have invented modern society as we understand it. The idea of society being contractual, being based on personal autonomy, on individual rights, rather than being the property of the king or a sacerdotal class. John Locke was a direct contemporary at Westminster School with a man called Henry Stubb, who converted. He became a Muslim convert. He wrote a book called A Defense of the Prophet Muhammad from the Calumnies of the Christians. Incredibly, in those days, schoolboys at Westminster School were taught Arabic, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic. Amazing thing. He was familiar, as the headmaster of that time was, with a lot not only of Islamic theology, but a lot of the works on property and contract, and a lot of English radicals of that time, late 17th century, were very attracted by what they saw as the relative toleration. This is in an age when, in this country, which was far more religiously pluralist than most of Europe, you could still end up being condemned for saying the wrong thing. They were impressed by the egalitarianism, And they were impressed by what they saw as the relative logic. That you were required to take less on faith. There weren't so many miracles involved. It was a cooler-headed religion. Now, I don't think it's very hard to say what John Locke's religious views were. He was a very furtive man. He was he was very reluctant to say anything that could get him into trouble. He burnt a lot of his papers. But we do know that he was in touch with an awful lot of people who had adopted an anti-Trinitarian view, had reached the view that Jesus was a prophet, and were in trouble potentially for saying this, and so had to be discreet about it, but they were in correspondence with him. And out of that comes, out of that ferment comes some of the ideas that make the modern Enlightenment. There's an economic historian called Benedict Curler who takes this one stage further and argues that capitalism was invented in the Muslim world. Now, conventionally, we say that capitalism was invented in England and in Holland in the late 17th century. Where did they get the idea from? They got the idea, goes the conventional theory, from the North Italian city-states. But where did they get the idea from? But this is where Kohler comes in. He says the unique thing about Venice was that Venice had a monopoly of the trading concession to the Ottoman Empire. They were called the capitulations. And Venetians would go to the Ottoman possessions. They would see camel trains being run on the basis, as I say, of a joint stock venture with limited liability. And they would say, well, if they can do that with camels, we can do it with our ships. And that this was really the birth of a property-owning modern society. You can take that literally, or you can think there's some truth in it. But what we, I think, can't argue with is that we see in that world institutions that plainly come between the individual and the state. They fill that Burkean function of being the little platoons. And actually, the supreme one of these is the Waqf, which we don't think of. So this is the idea of setting up a trust when you die and giving it a specific obligation. And just stop and think for a second about how weird it is in any society to prioritize the wishes of a dead person over the needs of the living. Right? It's, if you like, it's the ultimate individualism. It's the ultimate sign of respect for personal autonomy. Now, you could have Waqfs for all sorts of things. You could have them to look after orphans or widows. You could have them to create hospitals or artistic foundations. It's the principle of what in English law we call trusts. Right? And it's the same thing, which is so alien to a lot of Europe, of having this space ruled by contract and separate from government authority. In most of Europe, the idea that you'd have an orphanage or hospital or whatever, not run by the government or by a religious order directly, just run by a group of trustees, would have been unthinkable. By the way, I discovered the other day that there was a Waqf, I love this, for wives who felt that their husbands were disappointing. Someone had actually literally set up this charity so they could all go and talk to each other and say, well, you should hear what my husband just did. And the idea was that this would make them all happy and save their marriages, which I don't know whether it did, but I love the fact that someone could be that specific in laying down the charitable purpose of his organisation. So, look, where am I going with this? There is a massive mismatch in this country and in the rest of the West, not in this room, I hope, but in more widely, between the values espoused by British Muslims and how they are voting. It's probably the biggest mismatch of any group I can think of. People are failing to vote their values in large numbers, with, of course, honourable exceptions and all that, right? And I think that this is an easily remediable problem. I think it's easily addressed, but it requires those of us who are in public life to come forward and engage. If I'm completely honest, and I put all my cards on the table, the reason that we've ended up in this situation is partly because of the nature of first-generation migration after the war. If you look at who were the majority of migrants arriving here from Pakistan or from Bangladesh, these were, if you like, they were either textile workers or they were working for the government, NHS, London Transport, whatever. this would have been a left-of-centre constituency in almost any country, right? Unionised, working class, and anti-capitalist. That shouldn't have applied to their children, certainly not to their grandchildren. And I think we've ended up, particularly in my party, we ended up writing off because we said, you know, here is a population that is owned by another party, and we didn't engage and we didn't make the effort that we should have done. Given the pace of demographic change, it's enormously important that we do. But it's also, I would say, enormously important for any community in this country not to be the property of a single party. And I'd say that of anyone, right? Any ethnic or religious group. If you are seen as all voting one way, then the party that you're voting for takes you for granted and the other one gives up on you, right? So I think we need to try and rebalance from all sorts of points of view. But it should be the simplest thing to persuade people to vote their values. And that, I hope, is part of what my party is going to start doing in opposition. And I hope it's also going to be what organisations like the Adam Smith Institute engage and succeed in doing. Right? There is, of all the world's great religions, there was one that was founded by a businessman. I mean, how hard can it be to make adherents of that religion see good in free markets and in capitalism? So I think I've probably taken up more than my 20 minutes, but we've got a little bit of time left. I'd be very happy to take questions from the audience.